SECfans.com. Week 4 is here, y'all. Georgia fans know what that means. Missouri fans might not. It means we break out the computer model. And so far, we've done one game, Alabama A&M. That model was crazy weird. I expect some more of the same in this one because we don't have a lot of data yet. So where in the first few weeks of the year, we're just pure gut. Now we're going with a little bit of numbers and a little bit of gut. And we're going to get to a good prediction later in this video. Before we get into it, I want to remind y'all, please subscribe. If you haven't yet, click the subscribe button, and you might want to click the notification button because Tuesday we're going to do our first live show, 8:30 Central, 9:30 Eastern. I say Central because I'm in the Central time zone. You probably see it on the hat. And we're going to just kind of chat. We used to do a lot of review videos from the weekend before, and now some people have said that they want to discuss the weekend before and the overall just kind of landscape of college football, and we don't have time to make videos for it, so we thought we'd reach out and do a live show and see how it goes. It might be crash and burn and we don't do another one, or it might be something we do every week. We'll see. All right, Georgia, Missouri, this is going to be one that's really weird in the numbers because of the competition, the level of competition both teams have played, and because honestly Missouri is playing at a place where they, at this point in the year, where they weren't last year. They got blown out by Purdue last year. They put some points on and beat Purdue this year. So I'm interested in the numbers, but I'm also interested in discussing these two teams where they are in this point in the year. And I want to start this video off with a little bit of not an apology, because we don't know preseason what these teams are going to be. We have to go based on what we know and based on what we've seen a team lose and seen a team gain in terms of personnel, scheme, coaches, and etc. And we both said coming into this season that Georgia would win the East, but maybe take a step back from the team that they were last year. And it may be that they took a step back this year. It hasn't shown yet. I still maintain that they're not going to be as good of a running team, but I think they're better in the passing game, especially the wide receivers seem to have matured. Fromm seems really comfortable. For me, Georgia is, if we're talking about elites right now, from what I've seen, I think Ohio State, Georgia, and Alabama are the only 3 elite teams in college football. I don't think Oklahoma was elite. Their defense looked terrible against a couple of teams this year. I don't think Clemson is elite. Offensively, I don't think they're there. Is it safe to say that Georgia is one of just a few elites this year, and they're so far looking better than we thought they would?
I think it's pretty safe to say that. And our thoughts early in the season kind of had to deal with who they had, who they were coming back. It's really hard to gauge these things. And they've looked really good. And we thought there would be some major glitches because they lost huge pieces. They're playing like a well-coached team. They're taking advantage of opportunities. When they got, to a certain degree, it was an unforced error in the South Carolina game, right? The pass to the boundary early in the game, Bailey takes it, runs it back for a touchdown. First, you have to accept the fact that to a certain degree, pressure was there, but that was really South Carolina receiver who was open on the play, letting the ball go through his hands, basically doink off his helmet and go to Georgia for a touchdown.
Yeah, and I think it was a running back. I think it was Dowdle, Rico Dowdle. I could be wrong. I could be remembering this wrong.
Yeah, I think you may be right. Yeah, but
it was a missile to the receiver who happened to be a running back that's not equipped to make that play.
The thing to me in a game like that is that Georgia was able to take that and run from it, right? That they were able to take that result and capitalize on that play and to continue to capitalize on the mistakes the other team made without making that many mistakes themselves. A lot of that has to do with I think the core of experience they have.
Yeah, and I raised my hand, y'all, because I want to make a point in the point that he's making and have him react to it. In that, tell me if this is crazy, but in that game, the way they handled South Carolina reminded me of the boa constrictor analogy that people use for the Alabama championship teams during this run, that just kind of squeezed on you until the pressure made you make the mistakes. And then they just very cleanly and methodically capitalized on it until they beat you to a pulp. Did that kind of have that same feeling for you?
It did. It did. And It was interesting. And they were better. Now I'll give a caveat there, right? That my prediction was that Georgia was going to win by 17. I thought that it was a little unrealistic for people to think that South Carolina was as close to Georgia as they were. I took a lot of heat from South Carolina fans from that. And I think Georgia fans, if you followed this channel, I definitely don't play one way or the other with the team. I was very positive with Georgia really up until the point where they played Alabama, in which case I said at that point I felt like maybe they were going to get pushed back to a certain extent due to the quality of the opponent. I didn't think South Carolina was that high. So let's kind of keep that in mind. And the reason we do these predictions and we try to keep track of certain things is, for whatever we were wrong or right, I still thought South Carolina was only going to score 10 points on Georgia. So I think offensively Georgia was better, but it wasn't far off from our expectations. So I can say, safely, it's not like my personal paradigm shifted. Now you thought that was going to be more of a one-score game. I mean, you had it 30-23, I had it 27-10. So I think your expectations have shifted a little more than mine. I still think Georgia's better than I was expecting them to be. They're a more complete team. I thought they were going to maybe have more issues in the back seven. Granted, they haven't really been tested yet, which is going to be interesting in this game in Missouri. But I still thought they were a lot better than South Carolina. A lot of this really has to do with me feeling like the competition they played and the snapshots we had, I wasn't as high on those teams as a lot of other people were. And this whole discussion I'm having right now is to sort of point out to the fact that, in my view, a little bit of the media is going to overreact to what I thought was sort of an overestimation of their opponents.
Yeah, and they're going to overreact based on the fact that they thought, kind of like we just said, pollsters, voters, coaches poll, AP poll, they always do this thing where preseason rankings are based on nothing. And then when you beat somebody that's ranked or highly ranked in the preseason, well, that means you're really good, which is kind of hilarious to me. And South Carolina fans were mad at us because we, in our East preview, we talked about the fact that they played a lot of close games last year, a lot of ugly wins over a lot of crappy teams, and we weren't super in love with them. Now, we made a miscalculation in thinking Florida was going to be better than they are, and they're not. They're really bad. Offensively, they're really bad, but that brings me to another point, and it kind of fits with both of these teams because I feel like Missouri, if they're not challenging for that top spot in the East, and if Georgia comes out and handles them Saturday, they're still in it for, second place in the East, which it might be Kentucky that they're fighting for. What does that say when we're coming back to this point of not knowing how good Georgia is? What does it say about Georgia and Missouri and these teams as we get late in the season and they've played an SEC East schedule? How do we, I guess it's two questions. One, do we know, does that scare you a little bit in terms of assessing Georgia as being elite? Or two, is it a situation where, like Alabama, we've seen enough this year in the way they're playing to know, and we have enough history there to know that there's some hidden information there enough to know that they're elite and the competition doesn't really matter?
I think you can sort of look at what Georgia was able to do and the consistency of it and the way that they kind of dominated play in and play out and know that they're a very good team. And they definitely passed the eye test. A lot of it just comes down to looking at them and saying, one, the offensive line's really good. They have a quarterback that's already proven himself last year. They have running backs that are good. I'm curious to see how those guys do if and when they play defensive line that can really stop them. LSU may be the only one that they'll play. Well, I guess LSU and Auburn, right? They're going to have a couple times where they're going to get stopped. That's going to change the offense quite a bit. But defensively, they're a lot more athletic than the teams they're going to play in the East. I think they're going to have an edge defensively in everybody they play this year because I don't think LSU or Auburn's offenses are actually particularly good. And maybe that kind of wraps back around to this game. I think this is actually a pretty underrated matchup. You mentioned Florida not being that good. I still think, I was really not that high on South Carolina going into this season. I thought that ranking was pretty unjustified. I'm still not sold that Kentucky and Florida both may not be better than South Carolina. And that's not to say that Kentucky or Florida are that great. It may be that South Carolina was that underestimated. It's not a shot against Georgia. Georgia handled South Carolina pretty easily. But when you take it all away, I think really there's sort of 2 points here. One, I think Georgia's pretty good, but two, Missouri is going to be quite possibly the best offense that Georgia's going to see this season. And two, like you said, Missouri has a real shot looking at the East to make a play for it. And without saying that Missouri is as good as Georgia, I think there's a really good chance the winner of this game wins the SEC East. So I do think this is an underrated matchup. I think, and I'm going to flip around the other side too. We talk about teams that are over or underrated, what they did last year, how they played against bad teams. Missouri was definitely a team that underachieved last year, right? And I had been pretty critical personally of Barry Odom because that team looked like they weren't interested in playing, especially the first half of the season. They looked like they didn't care, and they played bad football. And then in the end of last year, they turned it on, and all of a sudden they started playing really good football, and they started to show what they probably should have been all season, frankly, which I do blame on Odom, but they look like a pretty good football team. And I wouldn't sleep on this game because I think at the end of the year, we're going to realize this game was a lot more important than a lot of people think now.
All right, and if we got any Tiger fans listening, I want y'all to know that we're going to pick your team apart a little bit. We're going to pick Georgia apart a little bit because that's just what we do. You listen to a lot of podcasts that are like team podcasts. You might listen to a Missouri podcast; they're very positive. We're going to be a little more on the negative side, but it's because we love you. You pick on your brothers and sisters, so that's what we're going to do. If I'm going to say a not so fast about Missouri, I'm going to say it looked like they didn't care first half of the season, and then it looked like they cared second half of the season because literally every team they played in the second half of the season until Texas in their bowl game was the very definition of a dumpster fire. And by the way, so far this year, they've played 3 dumpster fires. So Purdue is 0-3 right now. They lost to Northwestern. It was a close game. They lost to Eastern Michigan. It was a close game. They lost to Missouri. It was a close game. But, and I think some of that, there's a crazy play against Purdue, and they put on 10 points late. But I wonder if there is a little bit of fool's gold there, and we're going to get burned kind of like we did with Vanderbilt last year, where they played a few teams early and that were trash, and then they went in to play Alabama and they got destroyed. Is it Vandy last year, or is it maybe something different?
Well, I was going to try to turn to this later, so you didn't make me be quite as a negative in watching the show. I'm going to call you out a little bit on this. So he likes to push my buttons when he knows where my opinion's going to shift. So I have to end up being the bad guy here. I swear to you, I'm actually the nice one. But Purdue is kind of the major milestone for Missouri, right? And it's easy to look at that game and go, well, okay, well, they've got a real offense here. I think you have to step back and look at Purdue and what they did in the games they played. So Purdue offensively, they went into the Missouri game. They had 5.9 yards per attempt against Northwestern, 5.6 yards per attempt against Eastern Michigan, 10.4 yards per attempt against Missouri. They about doubled their per play averages against Missouri. Now we'll have a video. We're going to have a model later, and we're talking about stats now. We're going to have an explainer when we talk a little bit about our channel and how our model works and why we use certain stats over other ones. But the per play stats are pretty sort of damning that Purdue was that much more effective. Now, I will give a huge caveat here, which is a sign of hope, that David Blau for Purdue didn't play much in the first 2 games and then came in against Missouri and was way more effective than Sindelar had been for Purdue. So it may be that it was just a change in quarterback, but still, it's concerning that they got literally more than double the passing yardage against Missouri than they did against Northwestern or Eastern Michigan. And likewise, it's easy to be in love with the passing game that Missouri had, but they gave up a higher per play attempt average, a higher completion percentage to Eastern Michigan than they did Missouri. So there's a real shot that Purdue is just that bad. And what's more, it's easy to say that. The reason we like to get in data is I can tell you, looking at Purdue's statistics, Purdue was more successful in offensively and defensively with a pass against Missouri than they were against Eastern Michigan or Northwestern. The thing that I think people would underestimate, because they're saying the passing offense for Missouri is the big highlight, it's the run game that's out of character, because they held Purdue way below Purdue's season averages, and Purdue had been only allowing, or Purdue had been generating over 8 yards per play running the ball. They had over 8 yards per carry against Northwestern. They had over 8 yards per carry against Eastern Michigan. Purdue held them to under 3. So it's the rush game from Missouri statistically that has been very good, not the pass game. The pass game has merely been as good as other teams have been against the competition they play.
All right, going to go a little true or false here. When we talked about Notre Dame playing Vanderbilt last week, we said that in a lot of ways, Kyle Shermer in that scheme was a tougher challenge for Notre Dame than Shea Patterson would have been, even though Shea Patterson was the better quarterback. I think that proved out pretty fairly. Shermer had a day. They didn't put up a ton of points, but he had a day. I think he threw for over 300 on him. So I'll ask this. Jake Bentley, a lot of people were pretty high on him coming in this year, especially with Deebo Samuel at wide receiver. I think South Carolina as a wide receiver unit is better than Missouri. Let's accept that, even if it's not true. They did return a lot of talent and a first round draft pick in Samuel. I think Missouri has good wide receivers. I think South Carolina has very, very good wide receivers. If that's true, is it still safe to say that, well, let's do true or false. True or false, this passing game is going to be a bigger challenge for Georgia than Jake Bentley, Deebo Samuel, and the South Carolina offense.
True.
Yeah, I think so too. What about, so you say running game, Roundtree, Missouri hasn't really been a big run team. Is that going to bite them in the ass in this game in that they're not comfortable with it? They air raid teams aren't going to get it done against Georgia. I mean, even we saw Oklahoma last year. Rodney Anderson went off. I think he had like 150 yards, something like that. So can Missouri put up, not even win the game, let's say, can they put up 30 plus points with Drew Lock throwing it 40 plus times?
I think the more Missouri gets away from the run and gets towards the pass, probably the worst. And I think if you wanted to have a takeaway from this video, probably from fans of either team, though Missouri fans would be obviously more familiar, Missouri is a lot more balanced than people are giving them credit for. And one of the things I look at in my model, because I don't have quite the sophisticated data set to throw garbage time away, some do, is I look at rushing and passing attempts the first 3 quarters. That's one of the statistics I like to pull out. Missouri's run 99 run plays in the first 3 quarters, and they've run 102 pass plays. Almost dead balance run pass. And I think the perception is that Missouri is a pass first team. That's not true. They are very balanced this year. And statistically, what I'm saying is that they're a better run team. I'll throw out a fun statistic, by the way. Georgia has run 30 runs in first quarter, 30 runs in the second quarter, 30 runs in the third quarter, and 30 runs in the fourth quarter. I don't think I've ever seen that before, where they're completely balanced to the play in every quarter. There's just nothing particular about it, just being weird.
You shared me that stat earlier, and I really couldn't believe it. That's very, and I almost shared it with my wife because I sometimes share weird stats with her, and she would have just rolled her eyes. So that one was weird enough that I didn't even bother sharing with her. But that's crazy. That's pretty consistent, if nothing else.
Right. So, yeah, I would say Missouri's run game is the thing that's probably a little better than people expect.
All right, so we don't run long on this one. Let's go ahead and get into the numbers. Let the model sort of breathe a little bit, and we'll digest it from there.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, and we're saying in all our videos this week, we will do a model explainer and talk a little bit about statistics and what we use, because it used to be we had to repeat them every time. I'm not going to go into detail, but I encourage you guys to look for that video either hopefully the same day we post this Georgia video. If not, it will come the next morning. So it should be either Monday or Tuesday. But key statistics that we derive, I sort of derive intermediate statistics and then final statistics. Georgia is allowing 80% of opponent rush averages, 92% of opponent passing averages. We generally say against the run, an elite team can often hold teams to 70% or below of their rushing averages. 80% is very good. It's not necessarily elite. Huge caveat here, almost nobody has elite numbers in week 3 of the season. You don't have enough time, and too many teams have lots of garbage time data. It's just too hard to distinguish yourself this early in the year. Passing defense, though, 92%. That's good. That's actually not great. All right, Missouri is definitely the tale of two sides of the ball. And I say that because Missouri is allowing 50% of opponent rush averages. 50%. That's excellent. Now, that number comes off 2 games of data, and those 2 games are Wyoming and Purdue, which is why we've said this data might not be worth a whole heck of a lot. But they're also allowing 122% of opponent pass averages. So basically, the takeaway is, despite whatever you may think of Missouri, they're really terrible against the pass statistically and really good against the run. That's the objective neutral statistics. Again, none of my own variables here. That's just what the data says about the 2 teams. And then when you plug that in the model, it basically, and I calculate based off, again, I look at things like how much what your run to pass ratio is and all that for the different teams. It's predicting that Georgia will get about 3 yards per carry, so will not be able to run the ball very well, but will throw the ball all over the yard on Missouri at 13 yards per attempt. That's daggum high. Missouri is expected to be able to run the ball pretty well, 3.8 yards per carry, which is actually running it better than Georgia will, and be able to throw it okay at 8.1 yards per attempt, which is still functional. Still, Georgia has a 7 yard per play advantage to Missouri's 6. Where I think this gets screwy is in the score. The model has Georgia winning 43-40. Here's where I think it's screwy and why we don't have enough data yet. And we give a lot of caveats. One, we throw out all FCS opponents here. And I say that as a reminder. We have to do that not necessarily because the FCS teams themselves are bad data. It's the fact that all of the SCS teams' statistics, all their yardage statistics and everything were generated against other FCS teams. So all their relative data is worthless. We only have 2 data points. Missouri scored 40 points in both games. As far as my model's concerned, it doesn't really know anything about Missouri other than they score 40 points, basically no matter what the yardage is. Again, it's a blind model. We do it as a baseline. I have as little influence on it as I can in order to give ourselves a clean baseline so that we can use that to draw from as objectively as possible. So Georgia's 43-point number is probably pretty solid. Missouri's 40-point number, I think, is extremely suspect, and I don't have a lot of confidence in that number being accurate statistically.
And for me, I think that what's interesting is the note that you said about Georgia only averaging 3-something yards per carry and 13 yards per attempt, and that's based on what Missouri has been allowing. I think it's going to be opposite. I think they're going to run closer to 6, which, almost double that. I think they're going to run closer to 6, if not 6+, especially if Swift breaks a long run that can throw everything out, because I think they're going to be consistently good and plus maybe have a big run or two. And I think Fromm probably doesn't throw for 13 yards per attempt because I actually think he's going to throw the ball more in this game, which might drive those averages down. But I do like Georgia's points here. It's so funny because we don't love a lot of what early season modeling does, and you even touched on the Missouri, the overall score 43-40. We don't love that because there's not enough cross data points against good teams, and we're looking at a Georgia team who is shutting it down early versus a Mizzou that is having to play the entire game. And when you're having to play the entire game against trash opponents, it does 2 things. One, it overinflates a lot of your numbers because your starters are in the whole game. It overinflates them offensively, but it also signals that you may not be a very good team. Do you think that's a fair take?
I think it probably is a fair take.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and give my pick in this one. I like the 43 from the model, and I honestly last year, especially in the first half, Missouri put up some points. They had some success. And I do think there's the potential that they can pick on this secondary. I like 43-21, and I think it's a little closer. So I don't think they shut it down early and give up a late touchdown like they did against South Carolina. I like 43-21 with some of those points from Georgia coming in the fourth quarter. I still think that Georgia is a good bit better than Missouri, and I think, and here's why I think that, and here's why I'm completely willing to be wrong. I've seen this so much from the Alabama team that Georgia is successfully modeling it. And Georgia, that's not a slight. Georgia fans, please, that's not a slight. We're talking about the most dominant run in college football history. They might be winding down while you're starting up. To replicate that would be great success as a Georgia fan. So take it as a badge of honor, not a sign of disrespect. I've seen this so many times where a team that can put up video game numbers on offense, but is probably not equipped to handle a physical offense on their defensive side of the ball, have things just kind of melt down around them. And if you have to throw your way into a score, and I know you said balance, but even against Purdue, Drew Lock threw the ball 43 times. If you have to throw your way into a score to beat a team. So if you've got to score 40 plus to beat a Georgia, I just don't think it's there. There's a fly in here. It's killing me. I just don't think it's there for four quarters. And so for that, give me the 43-21. What do you got?
Right. So I'm not really too far off from you, and I have this game 43-31. So the long and short of it is, I do hedge the data a little bit, and I think there are a lot of signs here that Missouri is a better balanced offense than people are giving it credit for. Like you, I think, I still think Georgia is going to win this game, but I think what's going to happen is Georgia is going to have to win this one on the long haul. When we make these predictions, again, the same way we make these predictions, so we can go back and say the South Carolina game, don't overreact to it. I expected that game to be a blowout for Georgia because I wasn't that high on South Carolina. That's not hindsight or making an excuse. You can watch my video. That was my opinion, and it's still my opinion. In the same way, if this game ends up being a 3 or 4 quarter game, which it sounds like you also think it's going to be one that Georgia is going to have to play into the second half, don't overreact to that either. I think Missouri's just a much better team than people expect.
So you're saying that 43-31, you're saying that says a lot more good about Missouri than it does bad about Georgia.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Georgia's going to have to work to get the 41, and it's going to be impressive. And we talked about the run defense, but, and I'll sort of clarify that a little bit. Maybe Missouri fans will probably be more familiar with their team. Georgia fans will not. But, they had Beckner come in the second half of last season, started getting healthy, was a major contributor to their improvement defensively. They had some personnel changes. He ends up getting 8.5 tackles for loss during Missouri's win streak and was a big catalyst to their change. Him and Frazier were a good pair. And then also another thing is they have a transfer player from Texas, Jordan Elliott, that was kind of considered to be the MVP of their spring game. So when you took all that together, Missouri is a different front defensively than what Georgia saw last year. So if this sounds a little crazy, at least maybe you can appreciate the fact that you'll be playing different players than you played against Missouri last season. There's a reason why they may be better. And despite me saying that they're probably a lot better against the run than they were last year, and probably still a pretty darn good rushing attack, I still think you put up 41 points, and I still think you win by 2 touchdowns. I don't think you cover the 14. Again, 41-31, my prediction. But I think it has more to do with Purdue. And again, I just think, I think they move the ball pretty well. I'm pretty high on them. And I just think, I think they're a good football team. I think the fact that Purdue ran the ball for 8 yards per carry in Northwestern and Eastern Michigan, and I know they're not great teams, and then couldn't get 3 yards per carry against Missouri, says a tremendous amount against Missouri. If you can hold a team that, if you get 8 yards per carry, you're doing something right. Purdue has a rushing attack, and Missouri shut it down. So this is going to be a pretty hard-fought game, I think. And I think the 2 touchdown spread's fair, but I still think Missouri, I hedge a little bit towards Missouri on that versus Georgia.
So the Georgia fans are not going to love that. They're going to want to see a wider spread there. So if that plays out, let's say both of these teams are who you think they are. Can you still put Georgia in the elite group of teams that could truly challenge for a national championship? Is this a scheme mashup issue thing that's kind of unique? Or are you saying that a team that struggled to beat Purdue can play within 10 points of a Georgia, therefore Georgia may not be that elite team, top, up there with Ohio State and Alabama?
I think what I'm saying really is Georgia, right now, I think Georgia's run defense may not be quite as good as people think. Georgia has not faced a team that can pass. Let's be clear. Georgia's not faced an opponent that has thrown for 7 yards per attempt in FBS games yet. South Carolina and Middle Tennessee have not done it. Middle Tennessee, by the way, season average 4.6 yards per attempt is miserable. They cannot throw the football. So I think what we're going to see from Georgia is in week 4, this looks like a young football team. Okay, maybe they are kind of young. And what I'm saying is don't overreact to that. If they are what I think they are, they're still going to be a championship caliber team in week 12 and week 13 in the end of the season. I think this just may. I think we may realize a little bit how easy Georgia's opponents were up to this point. And I think we're also going to sort of see the players get tested, stand up to it. Like you said, there's a real chance here that Missouri folds, and that if they end up in a late game, I would not be surprised in the least if they implode and if Georgia sort of sees the switch flipped and they become a different team. But I don't know that they're there quite yet. So the question is sort of when that switch will be flipped, and I think it will be flipped at some point in the season. But regardless, they're definitely a complete team on both sides of the ball. They definitely have a tremendous amount of talent. And that talent level and the completeness of the team, especially given the landscape of college football and the SEC, as shaky as it looks, in some ways, looks dominant compared to every other conference. I'd be hard pressed to name many teams that could beat Georgia right now. So I definitely think they're a playoff contender.
Yeah, and I think, and this is where we might not disagree a whole lot on this channel. I do disagree with you, kind of with not what you said so much as where you're reading the data, and I also think that Georgia is elite, regardless of what Georgia's doing right now. I think the rest of college football has kind of taken a step back around the teams at the top this year. Maybe Penn State is as good as the last couple of games they've shown. But I think you're reading a little too much in Georgia's numbers against poor opponents because not only of garbage time, but something we talked about with Alabama last year, where you can only do so much good against crappy teams because their averages are already so poor. So any kind of movement throws these numbers off wildly, especially this early in the year. I honestly don't think Georgia cared about Middle Tennessee State at all. And we have seen other teams, even Georgia, do this against trash opponents where the numbers are hard to look at because they're treating it like a scrimmage. The thing I see is Georgia had games last year like Notre Dame. They won that game 20-19. Georgia was a much better team at the end of the year than they were at the beginning. So I will agree that they have shown a pattern of being able to grow throughout the season. I think if this Georgia team right now played that Notre Dame team or the current Notre Dame team, they beat them by 4 touchdowns. I could be wrong, but I think they've got so much talent right now that until proven otherwise, I'm saying Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia, and everybody else if they played it right now. And I think Georgia will be better at the end of the year. So maybe we're kind of saying the same thing, and maybe I'm just getting there before you get there, or maybe we're not saying the same thing. What do you think?
I think it's quite possible that we're on the same page here. I think a lot of it is I don't trust things until I see it. Right? And you know this from the show that I'm very stubborn, and I don't trust a team is improved in a different area or overcomes something until I've seen it, often multiple times. Last year with Miami, we had Notre Dame as a heavy favorite against Miami in that game. The model said Notre Dame should thump Miami. Miami thumped Notre Dame. And I was dadgum stubborn. And I said, I don't think Miami's that good. It turns out last year with that, I was probably right, that was a one-off. Sometimes you have data that doesn't look right, and I wanted to see Miami prove it. But at least they had a track record of it, right? I had something to draw by to say Miami hasn't been this good all year. Everything in the data says they've not. It's just, let's throw out saying data because that sounds nerdier than it is. They had not performed at that level in any game at any point that season before Notre Dame. Nothing they've done all year would warrant being able to beat Notre Dame like that. That was a one-off. With Georgia, it's a lot different because we don't really have any quality information. And like you said, when you play really crappy teams, both in terms of statistical modeling and in terms of the eye test, it's almost impossible to prove yourself. Because a good team, we say this a lot, ragging on Big Ten teams, right? That they want to make fun of us for playing Mercer when they play UNLV. Well, if you're a good team, you're going to blow out UNLV just as much as an elite team will. You can't take anything from those games in any way, shape, or form. You can only really draw data when you actually play a good team. That's the only chance to prove yourself. And it may well be that I'm reading too much into this where Georgia's played really bad teams and they just haven't had a chance to play themselves. But I think, my takeaway or kind of stepping a step back is I thought maybe Georgia would have some issues at the beginning of the season. I'm not as quick to discount them yet. I want to see Georgia prove it. If Georgia blows out Missouri, I will totally believe. Obviously, I already believe they're for real, but then my perspective is going to change in Missouri. I'm not going to think they're the same as I do right now. And I will think that Georgia's a lot more ready. But I am not quite yet ready to believe that Georgia isn't a young team. And based off what I've seen, I think there's a signs that Missouri may be a really good team. I think if Georgia was a very good passing team, based off the data I've seen, they would throttle Missouri. But because Georgia is a run-first team, this is a much tougher matchup than one would guess. Because Missouri's defense doesn't resemble the one from last season and has completely different players. And that's why I think this game may be a little closer.
I will say, if I'm going to put some statistical backing out there to support your point that Georgia may not be there as a run defense, I think it's a finer point, but also may be telling that when paired with a good passing quarterback and a run game, Georgia was not a good run defense last year. 167 yards in that first game to Kerryon Johnson. In the second game, he was hurt. I don't think you can really look too much there. 201 yards from Rodney Anderson against Oklahoma. And once Tua came into that game against Georgia in the second half, Najee Harris, 10 yards per carry. So I think there's something there. But also, a good passing game is going to open up the run a little bit. That's just common math. But so I think there's something there, but I still, what they did to South Carolina and how comfortably they did it for a team that I don't think is amazing, but last year it's 24-10. This year, boat race. So I think that's it for this game, y'all. Please remember to subscribe, and remember we're going to do our first live show this Tuesday, 8:30 Central, 9:30 Eastern. Feel free to jump on and tell us how crazy we are, Missouri fans or Georgia fans. Tell us how crazy we are for thinking that you might have a flaw or two. But thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.